Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Book and Author Society event. If you've attended any of these before, you know I'm going to do a very quick little spiel right now before we get to all of the good stuff. So hello, my name is Sarah Andrus. I am the secretary here at Book and Author Society. We are, and I will, of course, be addressing my notes. We are an organization aimed at promoting reading and writing and all things literacy, and we aim to help connect our favorite readers with their favorite writers. Starting in the spring of 2020, along with many other people, we moved online after many successful large in-person events. So now we are doing close to monthly virtual events with your favorite authors, and we hope to bring you more in-person events next year in 2023, as well as a return to our grant program. So any libraries out there, please keep a lookout for all of that information. Tonight, in honor of National Novel Writing Month, or NaNoWriMo, we are here to talk with Tim Waggoner. Tim is a writer of several novels, adult and young adult. He has published numerous award-winning short stories. He's a professor teaching composition and creative writing at Sinclair Community College and has taught in the MFA program on writing popular fiction at Seton Hill University in Pennsylvania. His books on writing include The Art of Writing Genre Fiction in collaboration with Michael Const, and his book Writing in the Dark won the 2020 Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in Nonfiction. So we are in great hands tonight to just talk about the craft of writing. Everyone who's attending, please feel free to type into the Q&A, and if you're feeling particularly ambitious, indicate that you're willing to pop in for a quick audio question. We have the technology now to allow you to actually interact with us. So please do that, and if you're uncomfortable with that, I will continue to read your questions. We're all good. Whatever you want to do, we'll be fine. So Tim, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me.
How are you doing? Is it absolutely dark at 4 o'clock where you are?
Yes, it is.
So one of the questions that I've always wanted to ask one of our authors coming on here, but I think tonight is the right night to ask, is what is your actual writing routine? You can break it down like you're on Vogue, like you're Stephen King. Give us all the good stuff.
Well, my writing routine kind of works around my teaching schedule, so it changes from semester to semester. But in general, over the last 2-3 years, I try to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning and write before anything else happens. And that is usually a good way to make sure that the day can't take my words away, no matter what, they're done. And then, maybe I'll write another session later on in the afternoon if I can, or maybe, I'll edit something, or I might do, social media promotion, things like that. Somewhere in there, I'll grade papers and teach classes too. So I have to do that. But in general, I'll tend to write in the morning. But when I get closer to the end of a project, especially a novel, I may write most of the waking hours until it's finished. It's kind of like a roller coaster. You're getting get up to the top of the hill, and then when you start going down, it just speeds up. So that's kind of the way it was. Before COVID, I used to go out to Starbucks and sit and write by hand because nobody was around who needed me. My daughters are grown now, but when they were little, they might need me, or I would start to get tempted by chores around the house because I'd be like, I need to do this or that. But Starbucks, nothing to do but write. Plus, if I got bored, I could look around, and there'd be movement and music around. So that kind of kept me stimulated. But COVID ended all that, and I just went back to composing on the computer. So I pretty much write where you see me right now. If I have to, we got a new puppy. So if I'm watching the puppy, I may write on the couch instead of having her in here. But this is the computer I use.
That's great. And the dogs do dictate everything we do. I am very familiar with that. I really loved what you were saying about writing, getting all the words out before anything else comes in. That's such a nice, I'm also a morning person. Mm-hmm. So that's such a nice way of putting that.
Yeah, I am not a morning person, but once my first daughter was born, I was kind of forced to live by her rhythm. And, so I do all right, but if I have my way, I go to sleep at 2 or 3 in the morning and not get up till close to noon. But life does not work that way for me. So
no, and that does sound like a more fun schedule. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about when you started writing?
Oh, I started it's really hard to say because I've been making up stories all my life. It was so natural to me, it didn't occur to me to make it a career until I was in high school and I'd read an article, an interview with Stephen King back when he had just finished Carrie and he wasn't a superstar yet, but on the verge of it.
Mhm.
And I had read it, and for some reason, even though I had read so many books in my life, it was the first time that it occurred to me that somebody could choose to be a writer. So I might have been 16 or 17, and around that time, I was making like I wanted to be a comic book artist. So I was drawing my own little comics, and I made like my friends and myself superheroes in them because I figured my friends would at least read them if they were in them. And they all talked about how awful my art was, but they liked the stories, and it made me mad because I was like, I don't want to write stories. But eventually, I shifted over to that. So I started seriously, writing with an aim of making it a career and submitting when I was 18. So that was, and I'm 58 now. So it was about 40 years ago.
Well, that's a great career. And to be submitting that young is really impressive.
Yeah, I didn't know any better. No social media, no nothing to make you feel, And I've read studies that say that, people in their 20s write and submit a lot more than you do the rest of your life. It's just the rest of your life, the stuff you're doing is better. So you're more likely to start getting it published, even if you may produce less and submit less.
Oh, I would believe all of that. That's a great statistic. And it gives something for like the excitement of what you're doing in your 20s too. Sorry, I have all of my notes off to the side, so
That's
I will
okay.
occasionally disappear off to this way. So you've been writing most of your life. You've done both fiction and nonfiction. Do you have a real preference? You do sound like you've come to love stories.
Yeah, my preference is probably for fiction. I mean, people who write nonfiction for a career will say it's so much harder because you have to research stuff. And I'm like, whatever,
No.
nonfiction is so much easier as far as I'm concerned. It barely feels like doing anything. But a lot of the stuff I write, since it's about writing process and it's about my experience of it, it doesn't require a ton of research. So, I mean, if I had to actually be like a journalist and research stuff, I mean, I worked for a weekly newspaper for a while in my 20s, and I didn't find that particularly difficult either. But I really prefer fiction. I really enjoy the creative aspect of it. I enjoy bringing all kinds of disparate elements together. I love when I'm working on a novel and all these threads kind of spin out, and then I start working on tying them together in ways I didn't expect.
That's very cool. You're a bit of a genre writer. Was that always your path, or is that just where your stories have taken you?
It was always my path. I loved horror from, when I was maybe 4 years old, and my parents showed me Frankenstein versus the Wolfman on TV. So not a very scary movie, but when you're 4, it was pretty cool. And it just fascinated me to these monsters that for some reason I was aware of in their own separate movies could meet. So the idea that their universe was bigger, it just really mesmerized me. So I read all kinds of horror comics and watched every horror movie I could find. But a lot of times the Saturday, like late night horror movie, they'd also show science fiction. And my dad was a big science fiction reader, so he would have all these science fiction and occasionally fantasy novels around. So I just read whatever he had. So I read a ton of all kinds of stuff. And I started off wanting to be a fantasy writer in my early 20s, but I found myself writing a lot of horror short fiction, and I still read a lot of it. I don't know why I didn't think about doing a horror novel till later, but it just seemed like as the years went by, people gravitated more toward my horror. It tended to be what got published more. And so I just kind of slowly and surely went that way. And since it was my first love, I still do that. But I also write a lot of tie-in novels and those kind of things. Sometimes they're horror, but sometimes they're science fiction, sometimes fantasy or action. You never know, depending on what kind of gig you may be lucky enough to get. So mostly I do horror and dark fantasy, but my tie-in stuff could be anything.
Can you talk a little bit about the different creative process there is to working on something like horror or dark fantasy? In full disclosure to our audience, I am doing NaNoWriMo. I am writing a fantasy time travel novel, so I actually want tips.
Right. So, I mean, the process of just like working with genre stuff, or I'm not sure what you want to know.
As the different processes and thought processes that might go into doing something like fantasy, or how genre is a little different from literary fiction, if you will.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's not. I mean, literary fiction tends to reject a lot of easy narratives. They don't want it. The idea of beginning, middle, and end. The protagonist has a goal, and they work toward the goal and overcome obstacles. It seems artificial to literary people, and so they often reject that kind of thing. Sometimes they reject it so much that they try to make their prose as boring and uninteresting as possible because it's anti-entertainment, and they go too far. I mean, you want to tell whatever kind of story you want to tell as a literary writer, tell it. But with genre fiction, there is more of an expectation that you probably do have recognizable tropes and maybe more of a recognizable form to it. There's a lot of crossover with literary science fiction, literary fantasy, literary horror, where they will still use a lot of the same techniques as literary writers do. So if you're writing more for entertainment, you might use the recognizable tropes more. You might use recognizable story structures like hero's journey and such more. But whatever you're writing, it comes down to character, because without characters, there's no story. In horror especially, everything is filtered through your protagonist. It's that way for anything, really. I tell students when I'm doing horror workshops, if you have a monster wandering around in the field and there's nobody there to perceive it and be frightened by it, it's not a monster. It's just a thing walking around in a field. It's like that thing about, if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody around, does it make sound? Well, there's no story unless there's a perceiver. So there's always whether it's for an entire story or entire novel or just an individual scenes with different characters, there's always a central consciousness that's experiencing what's going on. And yeah, you can write in, an omniscient point of view where you don't really get too attached to any one character. But in general, fiction works best when you are immersive like that, because no other media can do it. It's the strength of fiction still. Maybe someday they'll have, computers that plug into our brains, and then we'll live and believe we're living a story. But until then, fiction's the only thing that can do it. So I always urge people to think about writing from your protagonist's point of view. It's hard because even people who read a lot, they absorb so much more visual media, movies and TV shows and video games, and video games to a much lesser degree. But with movies and TV shows, the perception, the perspective is the audience. You're a passive observer, and that you can observe anything that's shown to you. And people try to write that way, and that doesn't work for fiction. Fiction works from the inside out of your character. And so that's true for anything. You could take any experience you've had, like when I was maybe 4 or 5, I don't know. I got lost in the mall, shopping center. Some older relatives took me there, and I just turned around and they were gone. And eventually they found me, but I panicked for a little bit. Now I could set that in the real world. I could set that at a spaceport. I could set that at a market in a fantasy town. I could set it in a real place, but all the people are replaced by mannequins and make it a horror story. But the feeling of being lost like that is going to be the same, pretty much. Yeah. And so you can build your fiction from anything inside you, and you can just go ahead and, in a way, it's almost like just changing the backdrop. Like if you imagine a play and here's the science fiction backdrop, and now here's the fantasy backdrop. So in a lot of ways, writing genre fiction isn't that different. The biggest thing is trying to get stuff correct that you might not otherwise, like how do police officers work if you're doing a police story, or if you're going to do like a sword battle, how long can somebody swing a sword before they start getting tired? If they're just a regular human, even if they're trained and at the peak of their whatever. Plus, in medieval times, they wouldn't have good nutrition. So how long could actually, keep going? There's a little bit of heightened reality where you don't worry about that stuff, but some stuff you do. Horses aren't cars. They got to take breaks every once in a while. So there's a lot of things you have to think about when you're creating an imaginary world, or even imaginary based on reality, that literary writers may not have to. But other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference between the two. Not before.
And that's a good point. A lot of the authors we talked to for these virtual series as well, all of our fiction writers are also doing a ton of research for those little things that they did not know that their characters need to know. You were just talking about how important character is. Can you talk a little bit about how you develop your characters?
Well, one of the things that I think is most important about character, even beyond, very fundamental things like age and gender and whatever, is just, how do they deal with challenges? How do they react to surprises? What do they do when the pressure is on? because those are the kind of things that tell you what decisions or reactions they'll make in the course of a story that shapes your story. So I think thinking about, how does your character try to get problems solved? Do they do it themselves? Do they try to avoid them as long as possible? Do they seek out somebody's help? Do they try to manipulate somebody else into doing the work? Like Tom Sawyer in the Fence, and he's like, if you know that kind of thing, then you'll know pretty much. And then what would they do if they're pushed to their limit? Because a lot of times in fiction, that's what happens. What's their breaking point? Where would they break and do stuff that they would never, ever think that they could do, and stuff that might shock them and they might regret them, or break them down to the point where they're never going to recover, like not completely psychologically, whatever. But I think if you know those kind of things, how they deal with conflict, how they deal with stress, how they try to get their needs met, I think you could tell a story that you wouldn't even have to work out anything else about them. It wouldn't matter where they came from. It wouldn't matter what race they were. It wouldn't matter anything, because you could still tell a story just from that. And then everything else is kind of like, not necessarily window dressing, because it could still be super important. But I think it's that core, part of humanity in there that helps you decide how would they react. And that's what spurs your narrative or gives you a chance to create your narrative. If you know that, and you know one thing they're trying to do or one thing that happens to them, you can make a whole novel from it at that point, because it's just one step after the other.
Is that one of the things that you're really drilling into your students then? That seems like it's probably a harder thing to come up with that type of character, just those really big building blocks. And I know. Yeah. A lot of times too, it depends on the person, because sometimes I'll get students who've been writing for a long time, and I'll also get students who they're just trying it out because it sounded interesting. So I kind of treat it like being a doctor, where a patient comes in and you diagnose what they need, and then you tell them this is what you need to do. And sometimes I'll get students who'll be like, tear my story apart. And I'm like, well, not until you learn what a verb is. You have to, you have something really basic that you have to work on first before any of that other stuff matters right now. So it really helps to kind of do that on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, I do try to drill in especially the writing from at least a somewhat immersive point of view. I think it makes for the strongest fiction. It's not the only way, to write. Obviously, people can write at a very distant sort of point of view, but I think it makes for the most impactful fiction. It's what I try to pass on to people. No, I think that's a solid statement. You want to keep everybody engaged, and you can't do that from 10 miles away. Right.
I feel like you can get people to switch from seeing themselves as the audience to seeing themselves like an actor on the stage, and just being able to imagine like that as they write. I think that's one of the biggest things you can do for people, in our culture today.
Yeah. Do you have any authors you're recommending to your students that they should be reading? Half of our authors are talking about how they're always reading. We're always reading here at Book and Author Society. That's why we're doing these events. So
yeah, it's really hard because, things will, I'll have different writers that I'm reading at different times, for all kinds of reasons. The writer that I tend to recommend the most, I just did this on a message board like 3 minutes before this started, there's a writer, he's a writer of nonfiction. He's a therapist. His name is Eric Meisel. It's Maisel. And he's a therapist who specializes working through helping people work through the challenges, the mental and emotional challenges of being a creative person. And it's all the stuff you don't get in how to write books. And it's really important. He has a book called Creativity for Life that's really good. I just read one called The Van Gogh Blues, which is about writers and creative people in depression, which is really good. And so a lot of the problems that people, mastering creative anxiety is another one. A lot of the problems creative people face, he addresses all this stuff that nobody helps you with. And so beyond any kind of writing craft, I think it's important they know how to tend to their specific mental and emotional health as a creative person, to help them not only be happier, but to be, more fulfilled and produce more stuff. So I recommend his stuff all the time.
That's fantastic. And I shouldn't be surprised that there's a book for everything.
Yeah, it's true.
But I've never heard of him. And that sounds like such a just helpful thing for a lot of people.
Yeah, he's got dozens of books. So his website's just ericmeisel.com.
Fantastic. And it's nice to see like advice like that with please take care of yourself and figure out your best process and all that, instead of the like 5 steps to getting published sort of thing, which I'm sure is also incredibly helpful once you have a finished product. But
Yeah, but it doesn't tell you what to do when, like, oh no, no agent took me on, or like
mm,
my very first book contract fell through for
oh,
reasons I still don't know. They just said, we're no longer comfortable with the book, which I think means that their business was about to go under because they didn't stick around much longer. But I don't really know. And it was devastating to me. And one of my friends said, "You're so lucky." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The worst thing that can happen to you did already." He said, "If you can get past this, you're going to, and you can keep going,
yeah.
you'll be ready for anything." But a lot of people do stop. I've met so many people, people that go through MFA programs or really intense boot camp type workshops like Clarion. They never write again after they get through it. It's really common. They get so burnt out.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I think the kind of stuff Eric Meisel writes about, I think would really help people to be able to get through that. I wonder a lot of times how many creative people just stop because there was nobody to help them through this, or, they just had no idea there was even help to be had. So I really do. I spend a lot of time recommending his stuff.
That, and your students are so lucky for having that. And that's a really great type of resource and a great outlook you have for your writing, and I'm sure what you're teaching them as well.
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about like the ways to get published, but I mean, you're the person doing it. I mean, all writing is it's psychology. It's just mental stuff. And so the more that you can help with your mental and emotional stuff, the more the writing's going to come out.
Yeah. Do you have any other I know you said you treat your students on a case-by-case basis, but do you have any like blanket advice you offer first day or last day of class?
Sure. And I'm actually sort of tempering this advice now because there's a sort of shift, but writing vivid fiction, giving people enough detail to imagine stuff without over explaining it. But one of the things that's starting to happen is there is a sort of a movement toward describing as little as possible, because the idea is that it forces readers to imagine things in a way they might not wish to. And I'm not really sure. It's just something that's kind of coming around, and I don't really know how much steam it's picking up. I don't really know how much can affect people. I think it may come from online culture where we write such brief things. And I think it's just what they're expecting at this point. They don't know what to do with a paragraph of description. It's too much for them. But I think if you can still sprinkle those kind of things throughout, and I tell people, if you want to create the illusion of reality through somebody's perception, you want to go ahead and not use just sight and sound. People do that because that's what our media does, but it's also our strongest senses. We can pick up information from miles, and if you count the stars, millions of miles away with your eyesight and your hearing too. But our weak senses, smell, taste, and touch also is just physical. So anything inside your body counts too, that you might experience. But they're weak senses. And because of that, things have to basically be in contact with you. So they're intimate and powerful. And people just leave them out. They don't think about them. But I tell people, try to make your story so that you have a character's thought here, there's a sight here, maybe there's a smell here, then there's an emotional reaction and maybe a memory connection. Because we experience the world as all this data around us, and we pick the stuff that, for whatever reason, draws our attention in a given moment. And the more you can do that, I call it anchor points because I just made this up, the phrase, but it's like the old fashioned tents that they make a little pyramid shape, but they're just rods and rope in canvas. There's just the anchor points that create the illusion, of a larger physical shape. And so the more you can do that, the better. And sometimes I'll describe it like a musical score, like the conductor can see, here are the oboes and here's the violins and here's the this. So you have one that's sight, one that's sound, one that's the other senses, then one that's memory, one that's emotion or whatever. Multiple emotions. And you just kind of go through the score like this as you write and kind of create, like I said, the illusion of reality.
Okay. Good advice. Very solid advice.
And it'll work for any kind of fiction.
That's what you've clearly been at this for long enough to become a very, very seasoned expert in giving this advice, because it does read for oh yeah, whatever you're trying to do, you can make this work as long as you're following building
Right.
blocks.
And if you want to check out your fiction to see how you do, just color code all these different things. And then, you have red for sight and blue for sound, and you go through your fiction. And then when you can, and then hold it at arm's length so you can't read it, but you'll see the pattern. You will see it's like Neo sees the Matrix at the end of the first Matrix movie. That's what you'll see. You'll see the matrix of your writing. A different color for dialogue to different color for exposition. And then you can see if you think that pattern works good for you, or if you're like, oh my God, I've got gigantic chunks of information, of exposition. Maybe I should spread that out a little bit. And you'll see it in a way that you cannot see it just from reading it, or even somebody else reading it for you.
Yeah. Have you noticed any major trends or changes in how people are writing we're such an online culture now, and you started when you were 18. I'm sure you could not go and check Twitter or update like a fanfic website or something for immediate feedback.
Right. Yeah, my first novel I wrote on a typewriter because PCs didn't show up until I was a sophomore, in college. And my dad always liked to have the newest of anything. We had the first VCR that was as big as a car, pretty much. So we had a real simple Atari computer, but it had a word processing program. But yeah, you couldn't obviously print it right away for somebody to read it. So the ease of self-publishing is great because it breaks down barriers so people can get their work out there, but it also is so tempting. I hear students don't tell me, but I hear from other students that they'll say, it doesn't matter what, XYZ, it could be a feedback person or it could be the teacher says about my writing. I can just self-publish it. Why do I have to change anything? And so it doesn't seem to have the same kind of, the process would force you to get better because you would write it and have to try to just go ahead and publish it traditionally. And if it didn't work, you'd have to try again. And if it didn't work, you'd try again and write another story and another until you kept getting better. It's kind of like Bill Murray and Groundhog Day. You just keep going until finally. And I don't know how many people go through that process anymore. I know some do because they'll post about it on social media. Writers in their 20s and 30s will talk about it. I recognize that's what they're doing. But I don't know how many people are bang out there. I finished my first novel when I was 19. It was terrible. But if I had the ability to upload it immediately, I probably wouldn't even check for spelling errors. I would just upload that thing. I've been so excited. And so that's a big difference. I don't really know how it's impacting people. It seems to have made readers a little more skeptical about trying stuff because they don't feel the same sort of necessarily quality assurance, but there's nobody to kind of vouch for it. I mean, if it's traditional publishing, at least somebody's saying, we thought this was pretty good. Whether it's, large press, small press, doesn't matter. I don't know. I think that's probably one of the biggest ones. I'm seeing some weird things online where people are being really nasty to editors and agents that don't take them on or reject them or something. And I don't understand this because I was brought up in the culture I grew up in, just learning from older writers. You don't do that. You bitch to your friends at the bar at a conference or something, or during a phone call or through email, but you don't ever lash out like that at people that, even if you want to burn that bridge, it's like everybody talks to each other. The agents might talk to each other, especially in genre fiction. It's a small world. It's like a family in a lot of ways. And so people know, and it's like, well, why would you cut off your nose to spite your face like that? But I'm just seeing agents and editors sharing a lot of that. It seems like there's a lot more of that in the last 3 or 4 years, and I don't understand where that's coming from.
Oh, that's very strange. And I know a lot of them are very overworked and underpaid, as is this industry, as is a lot of different creative industries. So I can't imagine going after somebody who would, in theory, be trying to make your work better at some point.
And things have changed so much. I mean, I literally sent my first novel into Del Rey Publishing without any agent whatsoever. And I got a response from them, a personal response, in 2 months.
Oh, wow.
And that was like 1982 or 3. And it was not that uncommon for that to happen. And now you've got one person doing the work of like 20 different editors, and there's no way in the world they can get to everything, no matter how hard they try. So yeah, like you were saying, that people are so overworked. I mean, I understand there's a frustration from everybody. And I also know people with technology expect almost an instant reply. And if they have to wait more than a couple of days, it starts to, drive them insane. But those are the biggest changes I can think of off the top of my head.
Those are some pretty significant changes, though. And I do see we have some questions in our audience
Okay.
Q&A. And everyone, please feel free to write in as many questions as you want. Otherwise, I will continue talking. And I don't know if you want that or not, but it's what you'll get. So starting off, we have from Melissa, your work definitely has a great shock factor moment sprinkled throughout. How do you determine what is too far and what isn't? Is there something you even consider when you're writing, or do you just write whatever comes to mind without thought? For some people might perceive it as being a bit too much or too intense.
That's a really good question. It depends on what I'm writing. So if I'm writing just one of my own horror novels and I'm writing it for myself, I'll just do whatever strikes me at the moment. A lot of times I don't plan out. I mean, I have outlines that I may not look at them. I may write the novel without it, but I have one. But they don't often have like really shocking moments in them in terms of description or things like that. It's just what happens when I'm writing. And I realize that at this scene, this sort of thing might happen. Or I suddenly have this weird idea and I'm like, okay, I'm going with that weird idea. And then I don't really worry about it. If something ever is too much, you know, I'll have my agent or one of my editors might tell me to pull back just a little. Last fall, about a year ago, I wrote a thriller novel. And my editor's like, no, pull that out. That's horror. That's too intense. Pull this down a little bit. If I'm writing for like a theme anthology, I kind of get a feel for, you know, is this going to be, is it something that can have extreme elements? Is it something that can't? I also wrote like last February a middle grade horror novel, and obviously there's weird stuff that happens and scary stuff, but I'm not going to do anything extreme for that. It's a very different audience. Yeah. So it just kind of depends.
Mike says, can you talk about how much emphasis an aspiring writer should put on reading early classics? Poe, Dracula, modern classics like Stephen King or Shirley Jackson, or contemporary popular works?
Read whatever the hell you want.
Love that as an answer.
Yeah, and you know, don't necessarily just stick to a genre, but you can learn a ton of things. Like one of my favorite writers is the mystery writer Lawrence Block, and his stuff is first-person narratives, usually very heavily dialogue driven. I don't do first-person narratives a lot, but I really learned a lot from his dialogue. Anything. One of the things you can learn a lot in terms of horror, both horror and romance are very emotion-driven, and they're very driven by heightened senses. You know, a lot of the stuff that happens in romance it's almost like they have super senses in terms of, you know, and it's that way in horror too, when you're so, you know, attuned to what's going on. In some ways, they're almost like flip sides. And, you know, there's an intimacy in horror, there's an intimacy in romance. And so there's a lot of horror writers that go back and forth, and there are romance writers that go back and forth in their reading. I just read that Margaret Weiss, who did like a lot of Dragonlance books and other stuff, she never reads fantasy because she writes it.
Oh, that's very interesting.
You know, why would she spend her day with, you know, basically work? Why would she relax with work? So it just really kind of depends. I mean, it doesn't hurt to be up on what people are doing currently. It doesn't hurt to be, if you feel inspired by the classics, go ahead and read them. But I've never finished Frankenstein. I've gotten halfway through. I could never get through Dracula because all the damn diaries and stuff. And, you know, they're being written for people that didn't have movie and TV to draw on. They needed stuff described for them. Like you would read a novel from, I don't know, the 1800s, and they describe a dinner party for 50 pages because people had never seen one or experienced one. I've seen lots of dinner parties with fancy china in movies. I don't really need a whole lot of that. And so you learn a lot about writing for an audience that's dead and gone. If you're trying to do this as a contemporary writer, it's different if you're studying literature. But I would, you know, read whatever speaks to you, graze around. You see somebody who recommends something, try it. If there's anything you think you're too good for, read it. Like if you think, oh, you know, I'd never read a damn romance novel. I'll never read one of the ones that sound schlocky, like The Billionaire's Third Forgotten Baby. You know, sometimes they give them these like kind of really, not exactly lurid, but sort of pulpy titles. And I think, oh, I'd never read that. And so that's the stuff I should read. I read one, because you should never feel like you're too good for anything like that. So I will try to do that every once in a while. Sometimes I may have to hold my nose to start, but then, you know, usually it's not too bad. And you can learn a lot from books that suck too, not as well as you can from books. You know, if you look at somebody and you say, oh, they did this is terrible, I'm never going to do that. You're not going to get that from classics necessarily. When I was in grad school, that's what people would read and compare their own writing to, and they wouldn't write. And I would say, you don't understand. That's like going to a zoo with the most exotic animals and thinking they're all normal. You need to go to a place with dogs and cats and horses. And, maybe someday you'll become something exotic in a zoo. But you need to learn it's okay to be a normal everyday writer. You don't have to be, at least in the estimation of whoever creates the canon, one of the greatest writers who ever lived. They're like fabulous freaks in a lot of ways. They're not replicable. They're all so different. You can't really become one of them if you wanted to.
And I really like what you said about like, it's fine if it's bad too. You can learn a lot from it. And like, think about how many like bad movies you watch that you still like completely enjoy, and those very middle of the road, like critically acclaimed, but kind of boring things you never think about again. Some of my favorite books and like movies are things that are like not good things.
Right. And you can get a certain rawness. I mean, you don't want to be one of the people that say, I never read because I don't want that to influence my work. That's like saying I've never eaten anything, but I want to be a chef. I mean, how are you going to be any good if you don't taste your own food? But, it's like, I think of like popular singers that they may not be the most schooled singer. They may not have any training, but their voices are so distinct. Their personalities are so distinct that it doesn't matter if they can't sing an aria, like the trained opera singer would. All those people sound the same to me in a lot of ways. I really like it when artists don't sound exactly the same. So there's a certain amount to be said for what somebody might say is bad, in terms of their, you're not being trained to professional standards, but it's okay to be yourself too.
All right. We have actually a friend asking a question for another friend. So Nadiza is asking for her friend who is in class and could not attend.
Okay.
Does every aspect of a character need to serve the plot of a story, or can they have certain traits just because?
Just because. That I randomly pick characters sometimes. Like if I've had maybe I have a villain in one novel be a woman, so the next time I'm like, oh, I'll make a bad person a man this time, for no reason other than 50% of the human race is one gender or the other. I mean, 52 maybe is like women, so women have a slight edge there. Or to make somebody younger or older, random. When it comes to picking the weather for a book, I look out the window because I figure if I don't, what I'll do is I'll just keep doing the same. It's like we're so used to weather being good in movie and TV shows because it's expensive and hard to shoot in bad weather. And it's hard to make bad weather look like bad weather with special effects. So it's like, I wrote several novels for Supernatural, in the Supernatural universe. Those guys don't ever have winter. They're never in snow. It's like they're supposed to be doing this stuff year round, and it's in the Midwest. There should be snow all over the damn place.
Well, that never occurred to me.
Yeah, because they always film, they film these things like in summer or fall, whenever people do their TV shows. Or if it's always filmed in LA, it's always, and they say it's somewhere else, but it's in LA. I love it when they show something from Ohio and it's got all these mountains and it's really sunny. And I'm like, oh, they filmed that in LA.
Reminds me of the MASH writers, if the actors were complaining too much, used to write Christmas scenes because they were always filming in the desert in California to remind them who was actually in charge of the show.
Right. But you can give your character something interesting, a personal tick or whatever, that it may actually become part of the plot later, but it wasn't before. Who knows? But yeah, there's no real, you don't have to have everything serve the plot at all.
All right. Hope that is helpful. I have another couple questions from Melissa. First, what would you tell a student who is concerned about being able to be fully original, such as a concern about having an idea that is too close to something that has already been done?
Doesn't matter. You can't copyright an idea anyway. You can only copyright a specific expression of an idea. You can't copyright a title either. You could call your book Gone with the Wind if you really wanted to. It has to be trademarked like Star Wars, then you can't do that. But most of the ideas aren't particularly original. There's not a damn thing in Star Wars that's original anywhere. Star Wars is recycling of all kinds of stuff. What made it original is how it was put together and how it was presented. Nothing original in Jaws. I mean, not even the novel. If you've read the novel Jaws, it's so different. It's like really boring. There's a lot of stuff with the mob and characters are having affairs. And I'm like, I read it in 5th grade and I was like, get to the shark. But that movie is just a monster eating people. And there's lots of ways to tell that story. Maybe not as good as Jaws, but a lot of it just comes from you. And the more you draw on your own personal experience, I'll do that in horror all the time. And it's like, so instead of writing like a vampire, I'm a create something. Let me pick something that I saw that was really weird. I don't know what. I saw a really strange bush that in the wind looked like it was reaching towards somebody. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write about this bush. And I never call it a vampire, and I make it its own thing, but it's a vampire story. And nobody has to know what you're doing. I'd say it's like taking an old trope and dressing it up in a new costume or something. But the more you draw on your own experience and just your own thoughts and your own ideas, even if you are doing, Star Trek type space stuff, it doesn't matter. It is going to be yours.
Do you happen to have a trope you feel drawn to regularly, or one you're really excited to always read?
I tend to, for reasons I don't understand, I tend to do a lot of like dualism in my stories. And so sometimes people will have like one way or the other, or symbolically, they have like two personalities, or like there's a spirit inside them that talks to them, or something only they could see. And I try not to do it too often because I do it a lot, but I'm working on a novella and it showed up again. And then I don't know why I do it. I try not to worry about it too much. I read a book by David Morrell, who he created Rambo in his book First Blood, and he said he realized a long time ago that his theme is like fathers and sons, whether they're metaphorical or real, and for whatever reasons that speaks to him, and so he just does it. And so it's there are I do have some of those things that occur like that. Reality tends to warp in like ways that are like a nightmare in my stories. I just find that really interesting and fun because I can do what I want, and all kinds of strange imagery shows up. And I try not to repeat myself as best I can, but honestly, sometimes I write stuff and then forget about it later. I don't even remember writing it, especially short stories.
You've had a long enough career that I'd be more concerned if you remembered every aspect of what you've written.
Yeah.
We have a question from Rob, and is teaching writing a viable career option for a writer who hasn't yet been able to fully support themselves on their writing income?
I don't fully support myself on my writing. I don't have to try because I love teaching and I wanted to teach. But at that point, I'm like, if I was a bestseller, I'd quit teaching tomorrow, but I also don't have to try to be a bestseller, which gives you a lot of freedom. I read an article not too long ago from the director of an MFA program somewhere, and he says in a literary program where there's even less of an expectation of making a living usually. When you're doing art for art's sake, it's pretty tough. And he said, I just tell my students to find a job that gives them time to write, whatever that is. And so you can prioritize your writing. And if teaching something you love, the thing I hate the most is writers that become teachers only because they want a paycheck and they don't care about teaching people. I mean, that's like horrible malpractice. I mean, you can do real damage to humans if you're really not helping them out, which is a hell of a lot worse than nobody cares if your stories get published or not. They won't know. You'll care, but you damage people throughout 20 or 30 years of your career by being a lousy teacher, not caring about them. But you also have to be careful it doesn't consume you so entirely that you never write again, because that happens to a lot of people too. It's kind of hard to find a balance. But I wouldn't teach in high school because that's a nightmare, especially the way things are in America right now. I would try to at least get a master's degree, and MFA is better, PhD is even better, and then try to go ahead and get a college teaching job somewhere. You can teach part-time, but that's good in your 20s. But once you start needing health insurance, it's not so good. You're not paid as much as the full-time people. You don't have committee assignments and stuff, so there's more time to write. You can also just hang out your shingle on the web. A lot of people do as freelance editors and, freelance mentors, developmental editors, line editors. There are a lot of people doing that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways. I think you want to go ahead and build up some kind of credentials ahead of time, whatever they might be. Because if you just hang out your shingle and say, I'm an editor, you may not do a very good job. Something might help you out. Like even in my college, we have like just certificates you can get in editing and stuff. It's only a few classes you might take, but it's something you can use a certificate. So, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of camaraderie in teaching. You learn an awful lot. I've learned so much as a teacher, probably more than I would have ever just as a writer from teaching writing. It's one of the things I love so much about it. So, but yeah, I would say it's viable, but anything is. I've got all kinds of friends who have all kinds of day jobs and all kinds of things that aren't teaching. You don't have to do that.
Yeah. We don't always have to be producing our art for the money, and finding a job you love, I think, is great advice there, or something that's at least allowing you time to write if you don't love it.
Right. And that can mean a job that doesn't involve your brain. There are a lot of people that like being a barista because even though you work hard, your brain is not involved creatively. And I read an article once that said that we make so many decisions throughout the day, but eventually we hit a point of decision fatigue where we keep making decisions, but they all suck and we don't know it. And, you know, if you have a job where you're making decisions like that, especially creative ones all day, and then you try to write afterwards, you really can't. And so if you can find a job that doesn't suck the creative life out of you, the creative energy out of you, that's a super plus.
Definitely. We have a comment based off of your character trait question to just say that it was very helpful and that they like the dualism aspect that you mentioned, and it's totally different from who we are, and it is very real and tangible as well as relatable.
Oh, good.
All right, Melissa is back. Melissa,
Okay.
you seem to be enjoying our panel. Thank you so much for coming. And she was wondering if you have ever considered offering an online course or if you've been teaching online through your college now.
No, it's really weird. My college, even though they have online classes to develop them, it takes years to get like permission to develop a new class.
Oh.
And usually they want the ones that are like comp that have a whole lot of people involved in them. So I bring it up every once in a while and it just hasn't happened. I've thought about doing it on my own, but I'm so busy that I just don't think I do a good job. But a lot of things like this is being recorded and going to be on YouTube. A lot of like presentations I've done, workshops with like, you know, my PowerPoints and everything else, they're all on YouTube. If you do a search for me and just look, you'll find like different workshops and things that I've done. I have a blog too that you can find it from my website. My website's just timwaggoner.com, and I write about writing there too. So I think maybe when I retire from teaching in about 6 years, I'm thinking maybe I might try to do that, or maybe find a place to do that. There are some programs that's all they do, where they have like part-time teachers who are professional writers and they teach online. And I'm thinking that might be good a little bit later on, and that way I can reach more people, be available to more people.
All right. Speaking of your YouTube channel, Melissa, back with another good question. Is there a story behind the hat? You always wear the hat in your videos.
Yes, there is a story behind the hat. I call it my stupid author branding hat. And I don't remember what year it was, maybe 10 years ago, there was a World Fantasy Convention in New Orleans. There just was one a couple weeks ago by coincidence. But, you know, I wore this because not a lot here, there's even less these days. And it was like May, June, I don't know what it was. It was sunny and hot. So this hat was just to keep the sun off my head when I went outside. And so my wife and I, a lot of people, because it was New Orleans, you'd only see people leaving the hotel or coming back because they'd be out doing stuff. Mm-hmm. And people would see me in the lobby and they'd talk to me and I'd have this on. But I didn't wear it anywhere else. And then people would ask me where my hat was when I was on a panel and stuff. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's not a costume. It's my hat. It's just to keep you from getting sunburned. I never wear hats. I just did then. So I was it was the party after the Bram Stoker Awards. I was talking to an editor friend of mine and I was explaining to her about the hat and she says, you need to wear that hat. I said, why? She goes, you're tall. Everybody will recognize you across a room from it. So at conferences, when they can't read your name tag or even your face is blurry to them, they'll know it's you. Plus, if people think it's like your signature, do it. She said, I challenge you to wear that hat for a year at every event. And I was like, oh God, okay, fine, I will try. And sure enough, it's like, you know, the thing, I feel silly wearing it. I keep it on a little, it's over here on a thing. I only put it on when I'm doing something like this or I'm at a convention. I don't wear it to teach. If I do a workshop like in my hometown, sometimes I'll wear it, but sometimes I won't. I just feel silly, to tell you the truth, but it works and people expect it, so whatever.
Secretly in everyone's mind, we're all cartoon characters with the same outfit.
Yeah, that's true.
But it works out.
That's the story. That's the story.
That is a great story and some good branding information in there, I feel like.
Yeah, it's weird because sometimes things, I had a writer once tell me that the world will decide how you'll be remembered, but the world will also decide in some ways who you are now, or at least who they think you are, and you can choose to embrace that or not. So, you know, if you dress a certain way at a conference, people will be like, oh, like the first time I got my job at my school, I wore like a shirt and tie and slacks because that's what I had worn as a part-time teacher for 10 years. But at my school, the teachers are corporate casual. So everybody thought I was an administrator. And so I was like, fine. So I started wearing, you know, polo shirts and jeans and everybody knew who I was. And so if people at a con, if you're at a con or whatever, or some of your friends are like, oh, that's so awesome, you should wear that. You try something on, you're like, hey, look, that's suddenly my branding thing. You can go for it. I resisted growing a beard for a lot of years because male writers often have beards. I thought it was such a cliche, but I eventually grew one. My wife wanted me to grow it back. I shaved it off and she's like, no, grow it back. So
You have say over your face, but your wife also has a little say.
yeah, that's why I got a ponytail too. I grew my hair out during COVID, and when it was finally time to go get it cut, she's like, don't cut it. I'm like, oh God, I feel so stupid with a ponytail, but whatever. She's the one that has to look at me. Nobody else really cares what it looked like. So
Melissa is back. She's also thanking you for all of your answers and says they are super helpful. And she wants to know, does it feel like a good thing that authors can now be more involved with their fans and have conversations with the development of social media? You are really involved and talk to a lot of people, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think that's great. It doesn't work always so well for people that are so famous that they draw people who want to attack them for various reasons. Sometimes you get the stereotype, it's always males, of the young writers, like gunfighters. They want to take on whoever the big gunfighter is to make a reputation. And so they start being negative toward them. Sometimes it's just people, probably they've got whatever issues they've got, but that means they can lash out at somebody. But, most writers don't get that. I mean, it's not like we're Joss Whedon, and like, where's Firefly? Or, George R.R. Martin, like, why are you killing my favorite character? Although I did get somebody upset with me because I killed off a character in my novelization of Resident Evil, the final chapter. Because I wrote a mini book between a scene, big, long 60-page scene that was a bridge between the 5th and 6th movies, because there's no linking otherwise. They don't give a damn if those things link up. But I did it, but I ended up killing somebody's favorite character, and she was really upset. And I'm like, it's only pretend in this book. I didn't really kill her.
You can go
Nothing's
watch
real
the
unless it happens in the movie,
So that is, at least, if that's the level of hate you're getting, I think you're doing
it's hardly anything. So
all right, we're almost out of time, but I will end by asking if there's any projects you want to talk about or anything you're working on now.
Well, I mentioned my website a couple times. You can reach me there. All my social media stuff is there, and my email is there. If anybody has any questions at all about anything throughout the rest of our lives, whichever one of them in first, yours or mine, you're welcome to email me anytime, and I'll do my best to answer it if I can. In terms of stuff I want to promote, there's if you read on Kindle or on the Nook, my novel, Will Rise. Do I have a copy of it here? Yep. This thing here, it's about a ghost apocalypse. Ghosts arise around the world and start destroying all kinds of stuff. But it's on sale for some reason for 99 cents. And it's been for a couple weeks, and I don't know why. They never tell authors this kind of stuff. You just randomly find out, oh my God, my book's on sale. So I'll promote that just because it's cheap. So if anybody wants to have a cheap way to try out some of my stuff, I got some stories and articles on my website for free if you want to go and check those things out too.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, I will say thank you to all of our participants. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am not 100% sure what our next event is, but it will be in 2023. We will look at doing in-person events, and we will, of course, be bringing you more virtual events. And again, our grant program will be coming back. So if any of you are librarians or friends of librarians, make sure you're checking out our website. We're around, or literacy organizations too. Just tends to be mostly libraries. We like other groups too. So Tim, thank you so much for all of your answers and for all of your insight into the writing process. You clearly love this craft, and your students must be so lucky because you are handling this with such a just gentle hands. And I don't think that's what everybody gets when they go into MFA programs or writing courses or anything like that.
Right.
All right. Thank you again. And we will see everybody in 2023.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.